Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you for finding me on this actually gorgeous winter's day here in Melbourne, where I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids, indoors or outdoors without any equipment, greenhouses, grow lights, humidifiers, really just me and them trying to figure out a way to live together. Now, if that sounds like your bag and conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. An amateur stumbling my way here, but some of the things I figure out might help you. And today, plant lovers, somewhat of a triumphant little video because it is midwinter, and depending where you are, midwinter can be somewhat bleak. Today, the sun is actually shining and it's blue sky, but it has been a rather cold, grey, wet and miserable winter here in Melbourne. Anyone from Melbourne will appreciate what I mean. Anyone from Sydney really will. And anyone from the Northern Hemisphere will perhaps laugh about me complaining about the cold, wet and misery. But it is always so delightful to have things in bloom. And I'm very lucky that there's always something in bloom. And this morning, a few things just gave me joy. So I thought, you know what, let's put them all together on a table and have a little chat. So first things first, of course, I'm in the Southern Hemisphere. It's July, and that means it is midwinter here. And my winter minimums can get down to sort of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, which is sort of 36-ish, 38, 40 Fahrenheit. Not freezing, but pretty close, and it certainly feels it. Now, the further out you get from the city centre, those winter minimums can get much colder, but for me, that's about where it sits. Of course, we also get quite hot and reasonably dry summers, so it's quite a benign climate for horticulture, I must say, and a lot of orchids can really cope with it outside as long as you do some due diligence. And in fact, I have a whole playlist of orchids that I grow outside all year undercover, which I'll link here. And then sometimes I bring things inside in winter, and some things are just inside all the time. And here we've got a bit of a mix. So let's just go through, I think. And you know what? We might do the commonest thing first, which is perhaps your common or garden no ID white Phalaenopsis. There we go. Look at that. This plant has got 2 flower spikes. Isn't that amazing? Now, true confession, of course, I didn't cause this to bloom. No, plant lovers. Here's the thing, and perhaps some of you will identify. If anyone knows that you grow or like orchids, they'll often give you a white Phalaenopsis. Bless them. So whenever people come for dinner, often they come with a white Phalaenopsis in bloom, which is of course a lovely thing, a lovely thing. And this was given by a friend and must have been now well over a month ago, probably getting on for 2 months. And honestly, the flowers just do not seem to have aged or faded at all. Like the best of us, it sounds like a Tennessee Williams play. She hasn't aged or faded at all. Anyway, basically, you're going to find a no ID white Phalaenopsis in bloom at any point of the year, anywhere in the world, I think, because that's just how they are bred. They are forced to bloom constantly in the horticultural trade, so there's always plants in bloom that can go to hardware stores and supermarkets and florists and garden centres and anywhere else where you buy flowers. And my take is I'm always very grateful. Look at that. I mean, they're so beautiful. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it is still such a beautiful flower. So I'm always thrilled when I get one. But I'm going to say, plant lovers, I now do tend to get a bit ruthless. So you know, sometimes they can just be a bit tricky. Now, I have got old no ID white Phalaenopsis hybrids that regularly rebloom for me, which is fantastic, either from a completely new spike or they rebloom from the existing green spike and produce another spike from that, which I'm very happy about. I made a video about that too. Basically, my white Phalaenopsis need to be doing one of those 2 things. If they prove a little tricky or recalcitrant, you know what, this is a terrible thing to say, because I don't believe in disposable culture. However, onto the compost heap it goes. I just don't have the space all the time or the energy to focus on a tricky white hybrid Phalaenopsis, which you can get for very little money in flower everywhere. So there you are. That's my white Phalaenopsis rant. But they are beautiful and I just adore it. So that's that one. And look at that beautiful pot. This is an old 19th century dye pot from Indonesia. Isn't it gorgeous? I just got that. Phalaenopsis back in the corner, and let's now shimmy this beauty into view. Look at that. Ah, the most gorgeous flowers. Now this, plant lovers, is Bakerara sea snake Unforgettable. And unforgettable it is. And it's so unforgettable that when I killed my last one, I bought another one. Yes, this is the plant that I bought. And as you can see, it is still in the pot that I bought it because, plant lovers, it was in spike when it arrived. And I didn't want to repot it. It's also midwinter, not a great time to repot Oncidiums. And so I've just left it in that pot, standing in a terracotta pot to give it some balance while I just enjoy the bloom. So it's midwinter and there it is. No fragrance. Sometimes, different Oncidium hybrids do have the most gorgeous fragrance, but not this one. But you know what? Who cares? Look at those flowers. They are enormous. They're the most beautiful sort of pale lime green and burgundy. Really, really, really beautiful. And this is one of those complex mega mixes of, I think, 4 different species types. So it is Brassia, Oncidium, Odontoglossum, Miltonia. So there's a lot going on, which means you kind of got to figure out the ideal conditions for it. Now, obviously, these are hybrids, so they're bred for ease of care and size of flower and regularity of flower, etc., etc. But for me, the issue is how cold can it go? And a couple of the species ancestors can take my outdoor all year temperatures. So my last one was outdoors all the time. And I don't think that was what killed it. I think what killed it was pure neglect on my behalf, which is that it got a bit overgrown by other things. So it's too shady. And I think I got it too wet in winter. So shade, dark, cold, damp. Who's going to thrive in that conditions? And it really didn't. It's a massive plant too. It does get really big. So that is an issue to bear in mind as well if you're interested in this plant. But such a striking flower, absolutely beautiful. And I'm just leaving this in a bright, warm, indirect light spot while the flower does its thing. And then in spring, I will repot it, not into a much bigger pot though. All of those Oncidium types, in fact, most orchids like to be really quite pot bound. So it's in quite a small pot in proportion to the size of the plant, but I will continue to do so. Anyway, Bakerara, sea snake, unforgettable, certainly is. And next cab off our flowering rank, you won't be surprised by this, plant lovers. Look at that. Dendrobium victoriae-reginae. What a gorgeous plant. Look at that. Absolutely stunning. Now, as the flowers age, they do tend to get a darker color. So that is quite violet. It's often described as a blue flower, but you know what? It's not even remotely blue. Anyway, that is beautiful. Now this one is flowering from a new cane. So this is the first time this particular cane has bloomed for me. And the flowers, as you can perhaps see, are coming from the very tip of the cane. Now subsequently, those flower buds will sort of emerge further up the stem, just above each leaf node. So it initiates blooming on a new cane from the very tip, and then it kind of works its way up the cane. So you can get 3, 4 successive flowerings from a cane before it then becomes a bit deciduous, in fact, very deciduous, and looks a little bit scabby. But don't trim these. Now, you might be able to see all those little sort of knobbles along there, those little grey knobbles. That is the remains of previous flower spikes along the cane. So you never know. You can get flowers on a leafless cane. You'll know when the cane is dead because it will really desiccate and shrink. So this is still reasonably fat and it's still got life and energy in it. So don't trim them, just leave those to do their thing. As you can see, this has got lots of new growth. And it takes about a year for the canes to mature and start flowering. So I've got here 1, 2, 3, 4 canes that have just matured, and that one has just started to bloom. This one has just started to bud, and the other 2 don't have any sign of flowers, but they certainly will. And I do get often quite a few questions about Dendrobium victoriae-reginae. I think it is something that people really want to have in their collection. I can understand why, because it's almost never out of flower for me. It did just go through probably about a month of no blooms, but essentially it's been in flower constantly for me. It took about 3 years for the plant to mature to get to that flowering stage. And the other key thing I think is that it does need more light than perhaps you will read about. So if you have got a mature plant that's not flowering for you, move it somewhere where it's in much brighter indirect light that you'd give other sorts of dendrobiums. See how it goes. Other thing with this too, it's one of those dendrobiums that doesn't really have downtime, so you do need to water it all year and give it a little bit of liquid tonic even in winter. I do water it less in winter, but it is still watered. And at the moment, it's actually moist because I watered yesterday, and it's a beautiful sunny day now, so it will dry out a bit over the next few days. But generally I water maybe about once a week, once every 10 days in winter, but not something that dries out. And interesting because it comes from high altitude in the Philippines, where obviously higher up you get, the cooler it gets, but a very misty environment. And victoriae-reginae, of course, named after Queen Victoria in 1897, which was the year of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. So this is when the orchid was discovered, and it was named after her because it was quite a year for queens. Next cab off the flowering rank, you'd be forgiven for not noticing. Look at that, Gomesa radicans. There we go. And I made a video about this a couple of weeks ago, which I'll link. It's a lovely little orchid. Does its own thing. Really, really striking flowers and a very, very light fragrance. Of course, the flowers are so small, you've got to get your head in. Now, I need to get my beautiful Chinese scissors and just snip out some of the older flower spikes. So its flowers came in two flushes for me. There was a flush that flushed when I made the video a few weeks ago, and then this is the second flush, which is out. So I should just trim off the older ones. But there you go. Radicans, as I said in the video, it means the stems sort of lollop along the ground and can root. And if you look at the growth habit of this, you can clearly see that it's a rambler and propagates itself that way. Anyway, Gomesa radicans in bloom midwinter, a miniature orchid, not that flashy, but a curiosity. Okay, look at that. Look at that. This is Oncidium sotoanum, and you can see these glorious sprays of pink flowers. Now, what you can probably also appreciate is that this is a species and it's found in Central America at reasonably high altitude. So again, it can take the cold weather. It lives outdoors all year for me. But you can see from that flower shape that this is one of the species ancestors for all those twinkle Oncidium hybrids. It's a real beauty. Mine isn't fragrant, and they're supposed to be, but you know, hey ho, that's just a clone I've got. It never smells. Every time it blooms, I stick my head in it, but no, it only flowers once a year. So the hybrid Oncidium types have been bred to basically bloom with each new growth that comes up, but most often the species will just bloom once a year. And I've had a lot of spikes. A lot of them are going over at the moment, but I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think, 7 spikes. So it's very floriferous once it gets going. It's a beautiful orchid, really very easy to maintain. It likes indirect light, so not bright indirect light, but indirect light. And again, it is an orchid that I tend to keep moist all year round. But a really beautiful thing, and I just adore the flowers. So easy to grow. There we go. Oncidium sotoanum, living its best life. Next up, plant lovers, ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. Look at that. What a mad, mad thing this is. Look at that. There we go. Aren't they the most beautiful flowers? There we go. You can see it better there. So this is Epidendrum centropetalum, and I've made a video about this. It has this really curious sort of aerial root habit. So they're not strictly speaking keikis, and it really concerned me when I first saw these emerging. But looking at pictures of mature plants, this is the habit that the orchid has. So at these points, it produces new growths, and it's that new growth that then flowers every year. So perhaps you might be able to see this was last year's growth, and it's got last year's flower spikes at the end. So they won't flower again. But that spike branches immediately to produce a new branch, and that is the one that bears the flower. So this is a completely new cane, and these flowers are all on the new branches from an old cane. So interesting. Now, you would be able to propagate the plant from one of these, of course. And I imagine that this is the plant's strategy for propagating itself. It will arch over and these might find a nook to cling on and blah, blah, blah. But all the pictures I've seen of the plant are just these tangles of branches and roots. But I just love this pink. It blooms at this time every year for me. It sits on the landing in winter, so I do bring this inside. I'm just fearful of it not loving the cold. But look at those flowers. It's just gorgeous to see. On a bleak winter's day, these bobbing little bouncy pink flowers. It's a stunning, stunning orchid. Again, it does get watered all year for me, a little bit less in winter, and I do take this one outside in summer to give it a sort of a tropical vacation, to try and get it hot and steamy and lots of air movement and lots of humidity. But I do bring it in inside, and it's fine. The flowering is always initiated whilst it's inside, so it clearly loves wintering indoors. And then the last two plants I've got here, this is my Laelia anceps, and I think it's a variety called Rosey Tiger. I made a video about this a couple of weeks ago, which I'll link, because it's bloomed really well for me. It's midwinter. Laelias always bloom at this time of year. I've got two others, but I set them back, which is very foolish of me. So one's got a flower spike, the other is just recovering. But the flowers last quite a long time, and one of them has just gone over. These are starting to look a bit scabby, but there's two spikes which are still really gorgeous here. So Laelia is a great midwinter flower. Again, they only flower once a year, but it's a great time of year for anything to flower. So if you can get yourself a couple, there's not a huge color range generally. They tend to be in the sort of the mauvey, pinky to white color spectrum. But I just bought myself a yellow species one, which I'm really looking forward to. Although it has now been reclassified as a Cattleya, because there's always argy-bargy about where Laelias and Cattleya sit. Anyway, I will call it a Laelia, and it's yellow. And it should flower at the same time as these, which means I'll have this amazing golden honey-coloured flower at this time of year. And then lastly, right at the back is one of my Australian Dendrobiums, and this one is a hybrid called Gippsland. And it's a mix of many orchids, including Speciosum and Delicatum in its ancestry. I've made a video about this, which I'll link. But really, it's still in bloom. Now, often with Australian Dendrobiums, the flowers just don't last very long. That has been in bloom for nearly 2 months with those particular flowers. Now, it's had a series of spikes, and two of them matured a little later, so I have had successive blooming from it. But essentially, it's been in bloom for me for a couple of months now. It's opened in late autumn, and now we're in midwinter. So it's again a fantastic splash of colour, and it's quite a beautiful tall plant. So it's by the front door, and it brings me joy as you walk in and walk out on a dull winter's day. Now, most of my other Australian Dendrobiums are just gearing up for all their late winter, early spring action. So a lot of those spikes are very mature and will all open pretty quickly. Some are still just emerging, and they'll open later in the season. And I will do a successive video about each one and put them all together for you. And Cymbidiums are also doing their thing. So all my species ones, the autumn flowering ones, obviously have just all gone over now. And the ones that are generally hybrids, which are just now, the buds are maturing, some of those have just started to open. So in another couple of weeks, I should have a huge array of Cymbidiums. So I might do a follow-up Cymbidium video. And I just noticed my zygopetalum, the one that I did a rescue video about, which I'll link here. Finally, the flowers are starting to open. I think another couple of days of sun and warmth, and they'll all be open. And I am definitely going to do a follow-up video about that, because I've never had a zygo flower before, so watch this space. And there's a few other things, of course, doing their thing. There's a Paphiopedilum that's just about to open, and there's something else which is in bud, but my goodness, that flower spike has just taken months, I think 4 months to mature, and it's not gone yet, but maybe it's waiting for a little bit more of warmer weather to actually open. But it hasn't failed, which the last one did, and it went brown, and it was obviously failing. Whereas this time they're still looking perky and beautiful, but just not opening. Anyway, I'm not going to reveal anything because it might still not come to anything, so let's wait and see. And also, let's wait and see to see what I'll be doing next week. Whatever it might be, plant lovers, I hope you can join me. I post every Friday, as I said. Do hit the notification bell if you want to know exactly when my missive pings into your inbox and the YouTube ether. And I hope where you are, all's well, that your orchids are being very kind to you. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, that they're giving you some colour and life. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you're enjoying the warmth. Anyway, good for you. I look forward to seeing you next week.